My name is Eleanor Mitchell, and I'm 78 years old. Some days, my body feels every bit of those years. The aches are constant, like old friends I can never escape. My joints creak when I rise in the morning, and my hands shake just slightly as I pour my cup of coffee. But despite these signs of age, my mind remains sharp. It clings to the past, holding on to memories of times when life was different, when the house wasn't so quiet. The house used to echo with the sounds of laughter, of doors opening and closing, of the hustle and bustle that comes with raising a family. My late husband, Frank, was the heart of this house. He loved a good meal, a glass of wine, and a story from his youth that always seemed to grow taller as the years went by. His presence filled every room, and when he was around, I never felt alone. But now, the silence is deafening. It wasn't always this way. When Frank was alive, holidays like Easter were a big deal. The house would be filled with the scent of roast lamb, freshly baked bread, and the promise of a full table. My children, Thomas and Jessica, would come home with their families. The house crowded with the sounds of children running through the halls, with the chatter and clinking of glasses, and the clatter of plates as we sat down to eat. Those were the days when the kitchen felt alive, and my role as a mother and grandmother felt purposeful, important. Today, it was just me, alone. I spent the entire morning in the kitchen, the way I always did. I prepared the usual spread: roast lamb, creamy mashed potatoes, glazed carrots, and the apple pie that Frank used to rave about. For dessert, I baked a lemon meringue pie, Jessica's favorite, and a chocolate cake, because Thomas had a soft spot for it. I had been planning this day for weeks, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they would come home. It was Easter after all. Surely, they'd remember the tradition. I couldn't shake the hope that they might show up like they used to, like they would when the kids were young and family meant everything. But as the hours passed, the reality began to set in. It was 4:30 p.m., and dinner was ready. The table was set for 4, but only one plate was filled. The silence in the house grew louder with each tick of the clock. The wind howled outside, and the branches of the trees scraped against the window, but inside, the silence rang louder than any storm could. I called Thomas first, expecting him to answer, as I always did. But as always, the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message. "Hey Tom, it's Mom, just checking in to see if you and the kids are still planning on coming by for dinner. I've made your favorite and there's a chocolate cake waiting. Call me when you can." I stared at the phone after I hung up, the buzzing of the silence filling the room. No response. So I called Jessica next, hoping for something different, but it was the same thing. Voicemail. Another message left, another unanswered call. "Hi sweetie, it's Mom. Just wanted to make sure you and the kids are coming by. The lamb's ready, and there's dessert too. Call me when you get a chance." I sat back, my heart sinking lower with each attempt. It had been weeks since I'd last seen them. Sure, I'd gotten the occasional text, the usual "hope you're doing okay, Mom," messages that only seemed to come when they were busy or when they needed something. I'd been invited to their homes once or twice, but it never felt like a real visit, more like an obligation, a distant relative they had to tolerate. I sat down at the table, staring at the empty chairs, feeling the weight of the years pressing on my chest. The smell of the food filled the room, but it no longer had the same warmth it once did. It felt like the food was just a reminder of everything I had been doing for so long, feeding them, caring for them, giving them my love. But today, there was nothing. I wasn't needed. I picked up the fork, poking at the mashed potatoes, but my appetite had long since disappeared. The table was still set as if I were waiting for someone. But I knew now that no one was coming. I had been waiting for years for them to come back, for them to remember what family meant, but today the truth was undeniable. I wasn't just forgotten, I was irrelevant. And that hurt more than anything. I couldn't sit there anymore. I stood up, my legs stiff, my body protesting the movement, but I forced myself to walk across the room. I needed to do something, anything, to get the feeling of being invisible out of my head. My eyes landed on the stack of bills on the counter. The reminders of life's obligations stared back at me, and for a moment, I just stood there, unmoving. Then, as if on autopilot, I reached for my coat and slipped it on. I needed to get out. I needed to stop feeling sorry for myself, to stop waiting for a family who wasn't coming back. I grabbed my phone and dialed Carol Benson's number. She was one of the few people who still checked in on me, even when no one else did. Carol lived just down the street, and though we weren't especially close, she was always kind to me. I hadn't called her in months, but somehow, I knew she would understand. When she answered, I didn't say anything at first. I just sat down on the porch, feeling the cool evening air on my face. My breath came out in little puffs, and I felt the weight of the tears I hadn't even realized I'd been holding back. "Carol," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "I think I've had enough. I can't keep doing this." There was a long pause, and then her voice came through, soft but steady. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. You deserve better than this. You really do." I didn't have the strength to say anything else. I just hung up, letting the cold air dry the tears I hadn't known I shed. The realization was painful, but it was also freeing. I wasn't going to keep pretending anymore. I wasn't going to wait for a family who didn't care. I walked out of the house and into the cold evening air, not knowing where I was going. My feet carried me down the quiet street, and as I passed familiar houses, I could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting through the windows. The warmth of family gatherings, of people enjoying each other's company, only seemed to remind me of what I had lost. It wasn't that I hadn't seen them at all. They'd been busy with their lives, sure, but it was the way they treated me, the way I became an afterthought. I had poured so much of myself into them over the years. I cooked, I cleaned, I watched their children, and I made sure they had everything they needed. But when I needed them, when I wanted them to show up, they did. It wasn't always like this. There was a time, not so long ago, when my children would fight to be at the dinner table. Thomas and Jessica used to fight over who could sit next to me, and the house would buzz with energy. Frank would be at the head of the table, smiling like the proud father he was, making jokes and keeping things light. But now the silence in the house was a constant reminder of how far I had fallen from being an important part of their lives. I walked aimlessly for a while, my thoughts running in circles. My mind kept going back to the calls I had made earlier, the unanswered messages, the empty promises. I had left messages with no reply, trying to convince myself it was just a busy day for them, that they would call back, that they would come over when they could. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. They were busy, yes, but they had also moved on. They had their own families now, their own lives, and I had become a distant memory, someone they only called when they needed something. I couldn't deny it any longer. My children were grown. They had their own lives, their own responsibilities, and it wasn't fair of me to expect them to keep the old traditions alive, to come back to a house that was no longer part of their everyday routine. I had spent so many years trying to be everything for them. Mother, grandmother, caretaker, housekeeper, that I had forgotten what it meant to live for myself. It had always been about them, about their needs, their problems, their joys and sorrows. But somewhere along the way, I had lost myself. I had stopped thinking about what I needed, what I wanted. That evening, I found myself at the park, sitting on a weathered bench under a tree. I watched as families walked by, children laughing and playing, their lives full of noise and joy. And here I was, alone, in the silence of my own thoughts. It was a familiar feeling now, the emptiness that had crept in over the years, slowly suffocating the person I had once been. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't know when it had happened, this gradual shift from being the center of their world to a mere figure in the background. Was it when they left for college? Or when they got married? Was it when I became just the nice, quiet mom they only saw during the holidays? I couldn't answer that. What I did know was that I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep waiting by the phone for them to call, or looking out the window for them to walk through the door. I couldn't keep trying to fill the house with empty expectations, waiting for them to remember the woman I used to be to them. I wasn't just a mother, I wasn't just a grandmother, I was Eleanor Mitchell, and I had a life of my own to live. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. I stood up from the bench, my legs stiff from sitting so long. The cold air bit at my skin, and I pulled my coat tighter around me. It was time to go home, to face the reality of being on my own, and to decide what to do next. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was just waiting for my family to come back. I wasn't just waiting to be needed anymore. I was starting to realize that I had been ignoring my own needs for far too long. As I walked back home, I found myself thinking about my own desires, the things I had put off for so many years. When was the last time I did something for myself? When was the last time I truly did something because I wanted it, not because it was expected of me? The answer, of course, was clear. I had given up on myself a long time ago. But today, sitting on that park bench, something had shifted inside me. I was tired of living for others. I was tired of being the one who always gave and never took. I was tired of being invisible. I stepped inside my house, the familiar scent of old wood and the faint aroma of yesterday's dinner hanging in the air. The house was quiet. Too quiet. And I couldn't stay here, waiting for a family who didn't seem to care anymore. I walked to the kitchen, the sight of the untouched dinner spread out before me, and I realized that I was done. I was done with waiting, done with pretending. I didn't know what my next step would be, but I knew it had to be for me. For once, I was going to live my life for me. I wasn't going to sit around, clinging to memories of a time that had passed. I wasn't going to wait for my children to come back to me. I was going to find a new purpose, one that didn't rely on anyone else. I woke up the next morning to the same silence that had filled the house the night before. The sun was shining through the curtains, casting a soft, golden light across the room. It was strange how the world could look so beautiful while mine seemed to be falling apart. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to rush. I didn't feel the weight of responsibility on my shoulders, the pressure to cook, clean, or make sure everyone else was taken care of. I sat up in bed and stretched, feeling the familiar aches and pains in my back and knees. I knew I was getting older, too old to keep pretending that I wasn't. It was hard to admit, but it was true. The days of running around after my children, of trying to be everything for everyone, were long gone, and yet somehow, I had never fully accepted it. I had kept myself busy, filling my time with tasks that distracted me from the emptiness I was feeling inside. But now, sitting in my room, I realized that I couldn't keep living in the shadows of the past. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the absence of my purpose, my place in the world. For so many years, my role had been defined by my children, by my husband, by the demands of a family that needed me. But now, that role seemed to be slipping away, and I was left to figure out who I was without it. I went into the kitchen, where the remnants of last night's dinner still sat on the table. The food had gone cold, untouched by anyone but me. The half-empty plate in front of me seemed to mock me. It was the same routine, over and over again: set the table, cook the food, wait for them to show up. But they never did. Not anymore. I cleaned up the kitchen in silence. The sound of dishes clinking together the only noise in the house. As I washed the last of the plates, I felt a familiar pang of loneliness. The house had always been full of noise, of chatter, laughter, and love. Now, it was just a shell, a place that no longer held the same meaning it once did. It was in that moment, as I stood there wiping down the counters, that I made a decision I had been putting off for years. I was going to stop waiting. I was going to stop hoping that my children would come back, that they would remember what family used to mean. I was going to take control of my life again, and I wasn't going to wait for them to give me permission to do it. But what did that look like? What did it mean to live for myself? I had spent so many years living for others, for my family, that I had forgotten what it was like to live for me. I needed to figure that out, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. I walked over to the small desk in the corner of the room where I kept my old address book. I hadn't used it in years, but there it was, gathering dust. I flipped through the pages, reading the names of old friends, acquaintances, people I had lost touch with over the years. I hadn't heard from most of them in ages, but the names brought back memories. Good ones, bad ones, but all of them real. I paused at the name of a woman who had been a friend of mine for years. Carol Benson. I hadn't spoken to her in a while, but we had always had a good rapport, and I knew she would understand where I was coming from. Carol had always been kind to me, even when everyone else seemed to forget I existed. I grabbed my phone and typed out a quick message to Carol, inviting her for coffee. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I knew I needed someone to talk to, someone who might understand what I was going through. She was one of the few people who hadn't treated me like I was invisible. I sent the message and put the phone down. I wasn't sure if Carol would respond right away, but I felt a sense of relief just from taking that small step. I wasn't entirely alone in this. I had people who cared, even if it didn't always feel that way. As I waited for her reply, I decided to take a walk. I didn't know where I was going, but the idea of sitting around the house any longer made me feel trapped. I needed to breathe, to stretch my legs, to clear my mind. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the crisp air hitting me like a wave. It was still early, and the streets were quiet. The world felt asleep, just like I had been for so long. I walked for what felt like hours, my thoughts racing. I found myself at the park again, sitting on the same bench I had sat on yesterday. The world was still turning, but I felt like I was standing still. My family was out there, living their lives without me, and for the first time, I didn't know how to fit into their world anymore. I didn't know how to be a part of something that seemed so far removed from who I was now. I sighed deeply, looking around at the families in the park, watching their children play. They were so full of life, so full of joy, and I felt like an outsider. I had always been the one to hold everything together, to make sure everything was in its place. But now, it was as though I had no place left to be. I glanced down at my phone, hoping for a message from Carol, but there was nothing yet, and for the first time, I didn't mind. I wasn't waiting for her to make everything okay. I was starting to realize that the only person who could do that was me. I stood up from the bench, brushing the dirt from my coat, and made my way back home. The house was waiting, and I was ready to face it, but this time, I wasn't going to wait for anyone else to fill the silence. I was going to start living for me. The days that followed that morning felt like a blur, but there was a clarity to them that I hadn't felt in years. I was still alone in the house, but the silence no longer held the same weight. It was no longer a burden I had to bear in the hope that someone might break it. No, this time the silence felt different. It felt like a space I had to fill, not with waiting or hoping, but with action. I had made a promise to myself that I wouldn't wait anymore. But now came the hard part, figuring out what that looked like. How did I begin to fill my life with meaning again, to reclaim the parts of me I had forgotten in the process of being everything for everyone else? That morning, I decided to start with something simple. I got dressed, put on a pair of shoes, and left the house. I didn't have a destination in mind, but I couldn't stay in that house any longer, surrounded by reminders of what used to be. I needed to get out into the world again, even if just for a few hours. The walk was longer than I anticipated, but it gave me the chance to think, really think, about where I had gone wrong. Where had I lost myself in all of this? I had been a mother, a wife, a grandmother. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped being me. It wasn't just about my children not showing up anymore. It wasn't just about the house being empty. It was about the years of giving everything I had without ever considering what I needed or wanted. And now, here I was, at 78, standing at the edge of a life that was slipping away from me, and I had no idea what to do next. I walked through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, passing by houses that had always been a part of my life. Some were the same, others had changed, but all of them felt like little reminders of how much time had passed since I had truly lived for myself. The world kept moving, and I had stayed behind, waiting for something, for someone to change. I reached the park again, the place where I had spent so much time over the last few days, trying to process everything. The bench was still there, empty, and waiting. I sat down, feeling the cold wood beneath me, and stared at the path ahead. The trees were starting to bloom again, their buds opening up to the promise of spring. It was beautiful, but also bittersweet. I had once looked at spring as a time for new beginnings, but now, it felt like another reminder of everything I had let slip away. I pulled out my phone and checked the message from Carol that I had received earlier. She had agreed to meet me for coffee. It was a small step, but it felt like the first real connection I had made in weeks, maybe even months. I wasn't sure what I was expecting from the conversation, but I knew I needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't look at me with pity or disappointment. Carol was kind, understanding, and most importantly, she hadn't forgotten me. I stood up from the bench and made my way to the cafe we had agreed to meet at. It was a small place, tucked away on a quiet corner of the street. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside, and the scent of fresh coffee and baked goods wafted through the air as I opened the door. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and Carol looked up from her seat at the back of the cafe. Her smile was warm, and she waved me over. As I walked toward her, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Maybe this was the first step in rediscovering the parts of me that had been buried for so long. We exchanged pleasantries as I sat down across from her. She was the same as always. Her short, dark hair was neatly styled, and her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She wore a light blue cardigan, the same one I had seen her wear many times before, and her face carried the calm expression of someone who had learned to weather life's storms. "I'm glad you reached out, Eleanor," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's been too long since we've had one of these chats." I smiled, feeling a small sense of comfort in her presence. I needed to talk to someone. I've been struggling, Carol. My family, they don't need me anymore, and I don't know what to do with myself. Carol listened quietly, her gaze never leaving mine. I could tell she wasn't judging me, wasn't trying to offer empty words of comfort. She just let me talk, letting me release all the frustration, all the hurt that had been building up inside me. "It's hard when you've spent your whole life giving, Eleanor," she said, her voice calm but knowing. "But you have to understand something. You've given so much of yourself that it's time to start giving back to you." I nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. I had given everything to everyone else for so long that I had forgotten what it meant to live for myself. But now, sitting in this small cafe, I could feel the shift happening. For the first time in a long time, I was beginning to see that it wasn't too late for me to start over. It wasn't too late to find a new purpose, to fill the silence in my life with something meaningful. "I don't know where to start," I said, feeling the uncertainty settle in my chest again, "but I know I can't keep living like this." Carol reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. "You start by letting go, Eleanor. Let go of the expectations. Let go of the past. You've done your part, and now it's time to live for you. It won't be easy, but you're stronger than you think." I looked at her, feeling a spark of hope that I hadn't felt in years. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe it was time for me to find out who I was when I wasn't defined by what others expected of me. We sat there for a long time, talking about everything and nothing at all. The conversation wasn't life-changing, but it was the first real step I had taken in reclaiming my life. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the strength to start. The days after meeting Carol felt like a shift, albeit a subtle one. I woke up every morning with the same aches in my bones, the same emptiness in my chest, but now there was something else too, something I couldn't quite name. It was as if in the course of that one conversation, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming myself, but there was so much more to do. I couldn't pretend that the ache of loneliness had disappeared or that the hole in my heart from my children's absence had somehow healed overnight. But there was a small part of me now that was beginning to understand that I didn't have to fill that emptiness with waiting, with hoping, with looking to my family to validate my existence. I could fill it with something else, something that was mine to decide. The first thing I did after meeting with Carol was take a look at my old journals. They had always been my escape when the world around me got too loud, too demanding. I hadn't written in them in years, but as I flipped through the pages, I was struck by how different I was back then. The person I read about in those pages was curious, alive with ideas and hopes. I had been a woman with dreams. Where had she gone? The entries were full of little things, trips I wanted to take, books I wanted to read, ideas for new hobbies I never pursued, and I realized something. I had given up on those dreams. I had put them aside for everyone else. But it didn't have to be that way anymore. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't a mere spectator in my own life. I closed the journal and stared out the window. The trees outside were still bare, but the buds were starting to show. Spring was coming, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. Maybe it was time for me to begin again as well. I wasn't sure where to start, but I knew I had to do something, anything. I couldn't keep living in the past, clinging to memories of better days. I had spent too many years in that space, pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. Now, it was time to be honest with myself. It was time to take the next step. I decided to sign up for a class. Nothing fancy, just something to get me out of the house and back into the world. I found a painting class at the community center. I had always wanted to paint, but I never found the time, or maybe I never thought I deserved to. But now, I was determined to try. I filled out the form, paid the small fee, and before I knew it, I was officially enrolled. The first class was on a Saturday morning. I remember feeling a little nervous as I walked into the small, bright room. The walls were lined with artwork, some abstract, some realistic, all different styles, but each piece had its own story. It felt like I was stepping into a different world, a world where I could finally be myself. There were a few other women in the class, all ages, all backgrounds, but what struck me most was how comfortable they seemed. They were so confident, so unafraid of being themselves. I wondered if I could ever be like that. Could I ever shed the layers of self-doubt I had carried for so long? The instructor was a woman named Rachel, young and energetic, with a warm smile and a genuine enthusiasm for teaching. She greeted each of us by name, asked what we hoped to get out of the class, and immediately made me feel at ease. It was such a small thing, but it made all the difference. For the first time in ages, I felt like I belonged somewhere. We started with the basics, mixing colors, brushing techniques, and learning how to apply paint to canvas. I was nervous at first, my hand trembling slightly as I held the brush, but as the hours passed, I began to lose myself in the act of painting. The strokes of the brush, the blending of the colors, the quiet focus, it was like nothing else mattered in that moment. The weight of my past, the loneliness, the doubts, it all faded away. By the end of the class, I had created something. A small painting of a flower, simple but full of life. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt proud of something I had done, just for myself. As I left the community center, the sun was shining brighter than it had in days. The air felt warmer, and I felt lighter too. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe I was on the path to rediscovering the parts of me I had lost. Over the next few weeks, I continued to attend the painting class. Each week, I felt more confident in my abilities, and the creative process became a way for me to connect with myself in a way I hadn't in years. I stopped worrying about what my children were doing, about whether they would call or visit. I stopped waiting for someone else to fill the void in my life. Instead, I was learning to fill it myself. One afternoon, I took my latest painting, a small still life of a vase with flowers, to Carol's house to show her. She was sitting on her porch when I arrived, sipping her iced tea, and smiled when she saw me approach. "Is that your painting?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. I nodded, feeling a bit shy. "I know it's not much, but it's a start." Carol took the painting from me, holding it up to the light. She examined it carefully, her eyes soft with admiration. "Eleanor, it's beautiful. You've really captured something here." I felt a warm flush spread through me, a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you. It feels good to do something for me, you know?" She smiled and nodded. "I'm so glad to see you doing this. You deserve it." We talked for a while longer, and when I left I felt a sense of contentment. It was a simple thing, painting, sharing it with a friend, but it was a step towards something bigger. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I was starting to see that it wasn't too late to begin again. I didn't need to wait for anyone else to make me feel worthy. I was worthy, just as I was. By the time the next month rolled around, things had begun to feel different. Subtle, but different. There was a lightness in my steps that hadn't been there before. A quiet sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. I was waking up in the mornings with a sense of anticipation, not the dull weight of routine dragging me through each day. Every day felt like a new opportunity, a chance to do something for myself. The painting classes had become something I looked forward to each week. The act of creating, of letting the brush strokes fill the canvas, became a form of therapy. Each color I mixed, each line I painted, helped me slowly unearth parts of myself that I had buried. I wasn't just painting flowers and still life anymore. I was painting my emotions, anger, grief, joy, onto the canvas, letting the paint take the place of the words I could never quite find. Carol and I continued to meet regularly, our friendship growing stronger with every conversation. We had coffee in the afternoons, sometimes at her house, sometimes at a little cafe nearby. She was always so positive, always so full of energy, and her support had been a lifeline for me. She never judged me, never made me feel like I was a burden. Instead, she listened, and sometimes that was all I needed. But even as I found peace in these small, meaningful moments, I couldn't entirely push the reality of my family's absence out of my mind. It lingered in the background, like an old song that you couldn't forget. My children still hadn't called or visited, and while I had stopped waiting by the phone for their calls, the silence from them still felt like a weight I couldn't quite shake. I had made peace with the fact that they were busy, that they had their own lives, but I couldn't stop the feeling that they had moved on, that I had become a distant memory to them. It wasn't just about the Easter dinner anymore, it was about the years of neglect, the absence that had stretched out between us. One afternoon, as I was walking home from the community center after class, I found myself standing in front of my old house, the place I had spent so many years raising my children, filling it with love and laughter. It was strange how different it felt now. The house seemed unchanged, but I had changed. And that change was more than just the things I had been doing for myself. It was internal. It was the way I was beginning to see myself differently. I took a deep breath and walked up to the front door, hesitating for a moment before I knocked. I didn't know what I expected or why I even felt the need to come here. Maybe it was because the house still felt like it held a piece of me, the woman I had been before, or maybe I just needed to see if I could face what had once been my home. The door creaked open, and there stood my son, Thomas. He looked different, older, more worn than I remembered, but his face still held that familiar warmth. He hadn't expected me, I could tell. His expression softened as he saw me standing there, and for a moment, the years seemed to disappear. "Mom?" he said, his voice surprised but gentle. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you," I replied, feeling the nerves creep into my chest. "Can we talk?" Thomas stepped back and motioned for me to come in. As I walked through the door, the familiar scent of the house hit me. The smell of old wood, the faint trace of incense we used to burn, and the warmth of a home that I had once filled with my presence. But now, the air felt heavy, as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. We sat down in the living room, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The tension was palpable, and I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on both of us. I had spent so much time waiting for him to come to me, for him to take the first step, but here I was, finally taking that step myself. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet. "I know I've been distant. Things have been busy. Work, family. It's been a lot." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I wasn't sure what I wanted from him. An apology? An explanation? Maybe just an acknowledgement of everything I had given and everything I had lost in the process. "I understand, Thomas," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I know you're busy. But it's not just about that. It's about the years of silence, the way I've felt like I'm no longer a part of your life." He looked away for a moment, his eyes searching the room as if looking for the right words. When he looked back at me, there was a sadness in his eyes, a sadness I hadn't seen in years. "I never meant for you to feel like that, Mom," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I guess I didn't realize how much I had been taking you for granted." I felt a small sting in my chest, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about blaming him. This was about understanding each other, about finding a way to rebuild what had been broken. "Maybe it's not just about you, Thomas," I said quietly. "Maybe it's about me too. About me realizing that I've spent so many years waiting, and I can't keep doing that. I need to live for myself. Not for you, not for anyone else, just for me." His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, I saw the recognition there. He understood. He didn't have to say anything more. "I'm sorry, Mom," he repeated, his voice softer now. "I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I really do." I smiled. A small, weary smile, but it felt real. "That's all I've ever wanted," I said. "To feel like I matter. To feel like I'm not just waiting for you to come around." We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight between us lifting, little by little. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. The conversation with Thomas was a breakthrough, but it didn't feel like a resolution. It was more like opening a door that had been shut for years, revealing a room full of dust and cobwebs. We had spoken openly, but there was so much left unsaid, so many years of silence between us, so many emotions buried under the surface that I wasn't sure how to address everything at once. After that day, things didn't change overnight. It couldn't. Healing wasn't something you could rush. But there was a shift, an acknowledgement at least that we both had work to do. And that was the hardest part. Understanding that there was no quick fix, no magical conversation that would make everything right again. The only way forward was one small step at a time. I spent the next few days thinking about what had happened. The house, once a place of chaos and noise, felt different. It wasn't just the emptiness I had felt before, the weight of being alone. Now it felt like something had been stirred up. Like the air in the house had shifted. I wasn't sure if it was a good shift or a bad one, but it was change, and for once, I welcomed it. It wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about me. I had spent so many years putting everyone else's needs before mine, and now I was starting to realize how deeply I had neglected myself. I had become a shadow of the person I once was, and in doing so, I had forgotten that I was allowed to live for myself too. I was still figuring out how to balance the love I had for my family with the need to live independently, but it was becoming clearer with each passing day. I had to learn how to be more than just a mother, more than just a grandmother. I had to learn how to be Eleanor again. The next Saturday, I decided to take a trip to the library. It was something I hadn't done in years, but books had always been a source of comfort for me. I used to read all the time when the kids were young, escaping into novels when the chaos of motherhood became overwhelming. But somewhere along the way, I stopped reading for pleasure. I had become too busy, too focused on everyone else's needs, to make time for something that was just for me. As I walked into the familiar, quiet space of the library, the smell of old books hit me. The atmosphere was calming, almost meditative. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books, feeling the texture of their covers and the weight of their stories. For the first time in years, I felt a surge of excitement at the thought of getting lost in a book again. I spent hours there, wandering through the aisles, reading the backs of novels, remembering the joy of losing myself in a good story. I picked up a few books, but I didn't rush. I let myself enjoy the process of choosing, something I hadn't done in a long time. When I checked out the books and left the library, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough. I had taken another small step toward reclaiming myself. I was beginning to see that life wasn't just about giving to others, it was about taking care of myself too. That evening, I sat down with one of the books I had picked up, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light on the pages. The story unfolded before me, but my mind kept drifting back to Thomas and the conversation we had. It had been a difficult one, but it had been necessary. I didn't know what the future held, but I was starting to believe that I could be part of it. Not as a mother who waited to be needed, but as Eleanor, a woman with her own life, her own purpose. The phone buzzed beside me, breaking my focus. It was a message from Jessica, the first one I had received in weeks. "Hey Mom, I know it's been a while, but I was wondering if we could talk. I've been thinking a lot about everything." I stared at the message for a long time, my heart racing. After all this time, was she finally ready to listen? Was she ready to understand? I hesitated for a moment before replying. I didn't want to rush into anything, but I also didn't want to ignore the opportunity to start rebuilding. I wasn't sure what this conversation would be like, or where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it. Not anymore. "I'd like that, Jessica. When can we talk?" A few minutes later, she replied. "How about tomorrow? I'll come by in the afternoon." I set the phone down and exhaled slowly, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. This was another step forward, but I couldn't ignore the tension in my chest. There was so much between us, so much that had gone unsaid. Would she understand where I was coming from? Would she hear me? I had no answers, but for the first time I was willing to find out. This wasn't just about waiting for her to come to me anymore. It was about being honest with each other, about showing up, not just for them, but for myself too. The next day, Jessica arrived around 2 in the afternoon. I opened the door to find her standing on the porch, holding a bouquet of flowers. She looked older, more tired, but the same warmth that had always been there in her smile was still present. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. "I brought these for you." I smiled and took the flowers from her. The gesture, surprisingly tender. We stood there for a moment, both of us unsure of what to say next. "Come inside," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "We need to talk." I closed the door behind Jessica as she stepped into the house, and for a moment, the quiet seemed even heavier than usual. There was no familiar chatter, no warm embrace, just the weight of the years between us hanging in the air. I wasn't sure what to say, or how to say it. This wasn't just a casual visit, this was the beginning of a conversation we had both been avoiding for far too long. We walked into the living room and sat down. Jessica placed the bouquet of flowers on the coffee table between us, her fingers lingering on the petals for a moment before she looked up at me. Her face was etched with a mix of guilt and sadness, and I could see the emotional weight she was carrying in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said, her voice quiet. "I've been a terrible daughter. I don't even know where to start." I took a deep breath, trying to steady the emotions that were rising in my chest. This was what I had wanted: the conversation, the acknowledgement, the chance to speak my truth. But it was hard. It was harder than I thought it would be. The years of silence and neglect, the misunderstandings, the unspoken hurt, everything came rushing back all at once. "I don't know if you've ever understood, Jessica," I began, my voice unsteady at first. "But for so long, I felt invisible. I felt like I've given everything to you, to Thomas, to this family, and yet no one ever seemed to see me. I've spent years waiting for you both to need me again. But you've moved on. I've become a stranger in my own family." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, but I could tell it hurt her to hear me say those things. "I'm sorry, Mom," she repeated, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been so caught up in my own life, in my own world, that I didn't even stop to think about how you were feeling. I didn't realize how much I was taking you for granted. I've made so many excuses, and I should have been there for you. You've always been there for me, and I never really appreciated it." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words, but I wasn't sure they were enough. The apology felt genuine, but it couldn't erase the years that had passed. It couldn't erase the countless moments when I had needed her, and she hadn't been there. "I've spent so much of my life giving, Jessica," I said, my voice a little stronger now. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot about myself. I forgot that I had needs too. I stopped living for me, and I started living for everyone else. I thought that was what a mother was supposed to do. Always put her family first, but I can't keep doing that anymore. I'm not just your mother. I'm Eleanor, and I need to start living for myself." Jessica nodded, her tears now falling freely. She reached across the table and took my hand in hers, holding it tightly as if trying to bridge the gap that had existed between us for so long. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been selfish. I didn't mean to hurt you. I love you, and I don't want to lose you." For the first time in years, I felt like I was being seen, really seen. Not as just a mother, not as just someone who had to sacrifice her own happiness for the sake of others, but as Eleanor, the woman I used to be, the woman I was still becoming. "I don't want to lose you either, Jessica," I said softly. "But I can't keep waiting for you to come around. I need to start living for me. That doesn't mean I don't love you, or that I don't want to be part of your life. It just means that I can't keep putting my own life on hold, hoping you'll notice." There was a long silence between us, but this time it wasn't filled with the same tension as before. It was a silence that felt like a beginning, not an— "I understand," Jessica said, her voice full of resolve. "And I'll do better, Mom. I'll be here for you. I promise. I'll make sure you don't have to feel invisible anymore." I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. It wasn't perfect. This conversation wasn't a magic fix, but it was a step, a real honest step toward rebuilding what had been broken. I wasn't sure where we would go from here, but I knew that this was the start of something new, something that I could no longer ignore. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, not just about the past, but about the future. We talked about the things we had both been too afraid to say, about the mistakes we had made, and the ways we could make things right. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally being heard. As Jessica left that evening, she hugged me tightly, her arms wrapping around me in a way that felt different than before. It wasn't the casual, hurried hug of someone who was too busy for a real connection. It was the hug of someone who had made a promise, not just to me, but to herself. "I love you, Mom," she whispered as she pulled away. "I love you too, sweetheart," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "And I'm proud of you." She smiled through her tears, and I watched her walk out the door, feeling the shift in the air once again. The house felt different now, not just because of her presence, but because of the space we were both beginning to create. A space where we could be honest, where we could show up for each other, not out of obligation, but because we truly wanted to. And as the door clicked shut behind her, I sat down on the couch, my heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally ready to live for myself. It had been a week since Jessica and I had our conversation, and though things weren't immediately fixed, there was a sense of relief that hung in the air. The silence in the house no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt like space to breathe, to think, to grow. It was a strange feeling, but not an unwelcome one. I had spent so many years filling up the silence with the expectations of others. I had been the one to keep the house running, to ensure everyone was fed, to take care of whatever needed to be done. But now, in this quiet, I was finally allowing myself the chance to live at my own pace, to consider what I truly wanted for the first time in ages. After Jessica left, I felt something change inside me. The weight of the years of neglect hadn't vanished, and I still carried the hurt of the past, but I also felt a new sense of determination. I wasn't going to wait for things to happen anymore. I wasn't going to wait for my children to come around, or for life to give me permission to live. I was going to take charge of my own life, even if that meant doing it alone. The next morning, I woke up early. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the urge to check my phone for messages, or to wait for someone to call. Instead, I decided to spend the day doing something I hadn't done in years. I went to the park by myself. I grabbed my coat, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The park was quiet, with only a few people walking their dogs or sitting on benches. I found a spot under a tree, sitting down and simply taking in the sights and sounds around me. The world seemed different somehow, brighter, more full of possibility. I watched the leaves flutter in the breeze, the birds hopping from tree to tree, and I realized how much I had been missing by not paying attention to the world around me. I took out my phone and texted Carol, asking if she wanted to meet for coffee later. I had come to realize that while I was learning to live for myself, I wasn't entirely alone. I had friends, people who cared about me, people who saw me for who I was, and not just as a mother or a grandmother. Carol, in particular, had been there for me in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. She responded almost immediately, and we made plans to meet at the little cafe down the street from her house. That afternoon, when I arrived at the cafe, Carol was already there, sitting at our usual spot by the window, a cup of tea in front of her. Her smile, when she saw me, made my heart lighten. Carol had always been a steady presence in my life, and I realized how much I had taken her friendship for granted. "Eleanor, it's so good to see you," she said, her voice warm as she stood up to hug me. "I needed this," I replied, sitting down across from her. "I've been thinking a lot, Carol, about everything." We spent the next few hours talking about the things I hadn't been able to put into words before, about my children, about the changes I was making in my life, about what it meant to live for myself. Carol listened quietly, as she always did, offering her insight when it was needed. "You're doing something wonderful, Eleanor," she said at one point, her voice full of admiration. "You're giving yourself the freedom to live. That's something a lot of people never get to do. And I'm so proud of you." Her words hit me deeper than I expected. It was the first time someone had really acknowledged the strength it had taken to make the changes I was making. I wasn't just moving on from the past, I was stepping into a new life, one that didn't revolve around what others needed from me. After our conversation, I felt like I was carrying something new with me, a sense of confidence I hadn't had before. It wasn't that I had all the answers, or that I was suddenly free of the pain that still lingered from the years of neglect. But I was moving forward, and that was enough. The next morning, I went back to the community center for my painting class. I had missed the previous week, but I was determined to continue. I wanted to keep doing something just for me, something that allowed me to express myself without expectations. The class was full, as usual. I picked up my brush and began working on a new piece, a still life of flowers, but with a twist. This time, I wasn't just painting a vase of flowers, I was painting my own emotions, vibrancy, and life interspersed with shadow and uncertainty. It was messy, imperfect, but it felt real. For the first time, I was creating something that wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. As the weeks passed, I continued to grow into this new version of myself. I didn't call Thomas or Jessica every day, but when we did talk, it felt different. We had begun to rebuild our relationship, but it was a slow process, and I was learning to be patient with myself and with them. I also began to take more time for myself outside of the painting class. I joined a small book club, something I had always wanted to do but never made time for. I went to the movies by myself, something I had never done before, and realized how liberating it felt to sit in a dark theater, just me and my thoughts. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy. There were days when I felt the weight of the past bearing down on me, days when I missed the way things used to be, days when I felt the sting of being forgotten. But those days became fewer and fewer. With each passing week, I felt more and more like myself again. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch, sipping tea and reading a book, I thought back to the woman I had been years ago. I had been so full of life, so full of dreams. Somewhere along the way, I had put those dreams on hold, but now I was picking them back up again. I didn't know what the future held, but I was no longer afraid of it. I was finally living for me, and that I realized was the greatest gift I could give myself. The days seemed to flow together like a river carving out a new path. Each moment, each choice, leading me toward a new chapter I hadn't expected to write. It wasn't that life had suddenly become perfect. Far from it, but there was a lightness to my steps, a clarity in my thoughts that I hadn't experienced in years. I had spent so much of my life taking care of everyone else, my children, my husband, the house, and in doing so, I had lost touch with the woman I had once been. But as the days passed, I was beginning to find her again. Not in grand gestures or dramatic changes, but in the quiet moments of choosing myself, in the small acts of self-care and self-love that had once seemed selfish to me. One afternoon, after a particularly fulfilling painting class, I found myself walking home with a sense of purpose. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the street. I walked slowly, taking in the beauty of the moment. I hadn't done that in years, stopped to appreciate the world around me, to just be. I had always been in such a rush, moving from one task to the next, never taking the time to simply exist. As I walked past the small bookstore that had always caught my eye, I decided to go in. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but the smell of the pages, the quiet hum of the store, called to me. I spent a long time wandering through the aisles, running my fingers over the books, reading the backs of a few, picking up a couple of novels I had always wanted to read, but never had the time for. When I was ready to leave, I noticed a small journal tucked between the shelves. It wasn't anything special, plain leather with a simple clasp, but something about it caught my attention. It felt right. I picked it up and flipped through the empty pages, feeling the weight of possibility in my hands. It was a journal for me, not for anyone else. I had spent so many years writing for others, taking care of everyone else's needs, doing everything for them, but this journal was for me. It was my time to write down my thoughts, my dreams, my fears, without anyone else's approval. It was time to rediscover the woman I had lost. Eleanor, the woman who had dreams and passions, the woman who had always been more than just a mother or grandmother. As I walked home, the journal tucked under my arm, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. It wasn't a perfect path, and there were still so many unanswered questions, but I was moving forward. I was becoming the woman I had always wanted to be. Later that night, as I sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of me, I took a deep breath and began to write. I wrote about the things I had been too afraid to face, the loneliness, the loss, the dreams I had put on hold, but I also wrote about the hope I was beginning to feel, about the possibilities that lay ahead. I wrote about the small steps I had taken to rediscover myself and about the joy of realizing that I still had a future to look forward to. The next few days were full of small victories, little moments of clarity and joy that felt like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. I spent more time painting, more time reading, and I even started taking walks in the morning, something I had never done before. I was finding my rhythm again. the rhythm of living for myself, not for anyone else. One evening, as I was getting ready to head out to meet Carol for our regular coffee date, my phone rang. It was Thomas. I hadn't heard from him in a while, and I immediately felt a flutter of nerves in my chest. Had something happened? Was he calling to apologize again? Or maybe, was he calling to finally tell me what I had been waiting to hear all these years? I picked up the phone, my heart racing. "Hello? Mom," Thomas said, his voice calm but full of emotion. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation the other day, about what you said, about how I've taken you for granted, and I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I don't think I ever truly realized how much I hurt you. I was so wrapped up in my own life, I didn't see what I was doing to you." I swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. This was it, the conversation I had been waiting for, the one where Thomas acknowledged the pain I had been holding on to for so long. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me, Thomas," I said, my voice steady, "but it still happened, and it's going to take time to heal. I need you to understand that." "I do," he replied. "And I want to do better. I want to make things right. I know I can't fix everything overnight, but I'm ready to try. I just need you to know that I see you, Mom. I really do." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I didn't try to hide them. I had spent so many years crying in silence, and now for the first time, I felt like those tears were worth something. "I'm proud of you, Thomas," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud that you're finally seeing what I've been trying to say, and I'm willing to work on this with you. But I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was before. I'm not going to keep waiting for you to come around. I'm living for me now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Thomas spoke softly. "I understand, Mom, and I respect that. I really do." We said our goodbyes, and as I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This wasn't the end, but it was a start toward rebuilding a relationship, not out of obligation, but out of understanding and mutual respect. As I walked out the door to meet Carol, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just moving on from the past, I was creating something new. I was creating a life where I was seen, where I mattered, and where I didn't have to sacrifice my happiness for anyone else's. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready. For the first time in a long time, I was ready to live my life on my own terms. The days following my conversation with Thomas felt like a slow unraveling of everything I had once believed to be fixed, and in many ways it was freeing. But as liberating as it was to step into a new version of myself, it was also difficult to face the fact that the person I was now, Eleanor, the woman learning to live for herself, was so different from the woman I had been before. I wasn't just trying to rebuild my relationship with Thomas. I was rebuilding me. As I continued to paint, read, and embrace this new chapter, I couldn't help but feel a sense of deep sadness too. It wasn't just for what I had lost, but for what I had failed to see about myself. I had spent so much time playing the role of a selfless mother, a quiet grandmother, and in the process, I had neglected to care for the woman at the center of it all. I had been so wrapped up in giving that I had forgotten what it meant to be seen for who I truly was. But change was happening. Slowly, and with every small victory, I could feel the pieces of me that had been buried for years coming to life again. One afternoon, Carol and I sat in our usual cafe, sipping our tea and chatting about everything and nothing, when she asked the question I had been avoiding. "Have you thought about seeing Jessica?" she asked, her voice gentle. I set my cup down, suddenly aware of the knot that had tightened in my stomach. Of course, I had thought about it. Jessica and I had made progress, but there was still so much that needed to be addressed. And while I was beginning to rebuild my relationship with Thomas, I knew that my relationship with Jessica wasn't as easy. "I've been thinking about it," I said, my voice careful, "but I'm not sure where to start." Carol nodded, understanding. "You've made so much progress, Eleanor. Don't let fear hold you back. You're stronger than you realize." I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. Maybe I was stronger than I thought, but the idea of facing Jessica still scared me. We hadn't spoken in weeks, and I wasn't sure what kind of conversation we would have. Would it be full of apologies, or would it be another round of misunderstandings? But Carol was right. I couldn't let fear dictate the rest of my life. It was time to take another step, just as I had with Thomas. Later that evening, after Carol and I parted ways, I sat on my porch, watching the sky change colors as the sun dipped below the horizon. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed out a message to Jessica. "I think it's time we talked again," I wrote, feeling a wave of nervousness wash over me. "When you have time, I'd like to see you." I hit send, immediately regretting it. What if she didn't want to see me? What if she wasn't ready? But I knew, deep down, that this was something I had to do for myself. Not just for her. I wasn't just a mother waiting to be needed. I was Eleanor, and I was taking control of my own life. I didn't hear from her that night, but by the next morning, I had a reply. "I'd like that, Mom," she wrote. "I've been thinking about things too. Let's meet tomorrow afternoon." I let out a breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was a step forward, and that was all I could ask for. The next afternoon, I stood outside the cafe where we had agreed to meet, feeling the nerves creep up my spine again. It wasn't fear this time, it was uncertainty. I didn't know what to expect, and I wasn't sure if we could fully heal the rift between us in one conversation. But I was willing to try. When Jessica arrived, she looked different. She had always had a smile that could light up a room, but now it was tempered with something else. Something deeper. Her eyes looked tired, but there was a softness to her demeanor that made me feel a flicker of hope. "Mom," she said softly. As she approached, her voice tinged with emotion. "I'm sorry, I've been terrible. I've hurt you, and I don't know how to fix it. I know I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I see you now. I understand, and I'm so sorry." I felt a rush of emotions, but I didn't want to cry, not yet, not when we were finally getting to the heart of everything. "Jessica," I said, my voice steady but full of emotion. "I've spent years waiting for you to come around, hoping you would see me, but I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was before. I'm learning to live for myself, and I'm proud of you for seeing me now, but I can't keep waiting for you to notice me. I need you to understand that too." She nodded, her face softening. "I know, Mom, I know. I've been selfish, and I've been blind to what you've been going through. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you." There was a long pause as we both took a deep breath. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. A start that would take time, but a start nonetheless. "I'm not asking for everything to be fixed right away," I said, my voice quieter now. "I'm not asking for you to make everything better. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to just be the person you call when it's convenient. I'm Eleanor, and I deserve more than that." Jessica reached across the table, her hand gently resting on mine. "I understand, Mom. I really do. And I promise I'll do better. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." I smiled, a tear escaping my eye. "Thank you, Jessica. That's all I needed to hear." The rest of the afternoon was spent in quiet conversation, not full of apologies, but full of understanding. For the first time in years, I felt like my daughter and I were on the same page. We weren't the same people we had been, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to rebuild our relationship, brick by brick, until we could find a way to be the family we were always meant to be. As we left the cafe, Jessica hugged me tightly, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the start of something real. The days following my meeting with Jessica were quiet, but not in the same oppressive way they had been before. There was a gentleness in the air now, a subtle shift that told me we were on the right path, even if it was a difficult one. My relationship with Jessica was far from perfect, and I knew it would take time to truly heal, but for the first time, I felt like there was hope for us. I wasn't waiting for her to come to me anymore. I was showing up for myself, and in doing so, I was showing up for her as well. The next few weeks were a balance of small victories and difficult truths. Jessica and I had another conversation a few days after our meeting at the cafe, and while it wasn't easy, it was necessary. We talked about the years of silence, the misunderstandings, and the things that had hurt us both. And while there were still moments of tension, I could sense a change in her, a willingness to truly listen, to understand, and to work towards something better. I continued to paint, to read, to take walks in the park. Each day, I felt a little more like myself again. The weight of the past was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy as it once had. I was no longer trying to fill the emptiness with the demands of others. I was learning to fill it with my own needs, my own desires. One afternoon, as I was walking to the community center for my painting class, I received a call from Thomas. My heart skipped a beat, a nervous excitement flooding me. It had been a few weeks since our last conversation, and I wasn't sure what this call would bring. "Hey, Mom," his voice came through the phone, sounding more relaxed than I had heard in a long time. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I think it's time for us to have a proper conversation, one where I'm really listening." I stopped walking for a moment, feeling the weight of his words settle in. "I'd like that, Thomas," I said softly. "I think it's time for us to have that conversation, too." We set a time to meet later that week, and as I hung up the phone, I felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Our relationship had been strained for so long, and while we had made progress, I knew we still had a long way to go. But the fact that he was willing to reach out, to listen, to understand, this was progress in itself. I didn't know what the conversation would hold, but I was ready to face it, just as I had faced everything else in the last few months. The day of our meeting arrived, and I sat in the cafe, waiting for Thomas to show up. As I looked around, I noticed the small things, the way the light filtered through the windows, the quiet hum of conversations around me, the sense of peace that had settled into my life. I had fought for this peace, fought to stop waiting for the phone calls, the visits, the acknowledgement. I had learned that I was enough, and that I didn't have to wait for others to see that. When Thomas walked into the cafe, I could see the change in him too. He wasn't the same person he had been when we last spoke. There was a softness to his expression, a calmness to his demeanor that made me believe he had truly been reflecting on everything I had said. "Mom," he said, sitting down across from me, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I've been taking you for granted. And I want you to know that I'm sorry. I've always assumed you'd be there for me, and I never stopped to think about what that was doing to you. I've been selfish, and I don't want to keep making that mistake." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I swallowed it down. This wasn't just an apology. This was a moment of real understanding, a moment that had taken years to arrive. "I don't want to keep living in the past, Thomas," I said, my voice steady but full of emotion. "We can change what happened, but we can start fresh. And I need you to understand that I'm not just your mom. I'm Eleanor, and I need to live for me now." He nodded, his eyes full of sincerity. "I understand, Mom. I really do. And I want to do better. I don't want to take you for granted anymore." We talked for a while longer, sharing our thoughts and feelings. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was real, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were truly hearing each other. As we said goodbye, Thomas hugged me tightly. It wasn't the stiff, reluctant hug of the past. It was warm, genuine, a sign that things were changing, slowly but surely. The conversation with Thomas was a turning point for me. It wasn't just about healing the rift between us, it was about realizing that I was no longer the woman who waited in the background. I was a woman who had a voice, a woman who was allowed to take up space, to be seen, to be heard. I didn't need to wait for anyone to tell me I was important. I was important, just as I was. That evening, I sat down with my journal, reflecting on the progress I had made. The pages were filled with thoughts, hopes, and dreams that I had kept hidden for so long. I wasn't just writing about my family or about the past. I was writing about me, about who I was becoming and who I wanted to be. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. It was early spring when I realized that I had stopped waiting. Not for the phone calls from my children, not for apologies or acknowledgments. I had stopped waiting for life to come to me, and started living it myself. And as each day passed, I began to see that the act of living was its own kind of healing. The transformation in my relationships, particularly with Thomas and Jessica, hadn't been instant. It wasn't some magical fix that erased the pain, the resentment, or the years of silence. But we were trying, each of us in our own way, to rebuild what had been broken. I didn't know what the future would look like for us. But I knew one thing for sure: I had started to live for me again. And that felt like a victory all on its own. It was late one afternoon, just before sunset, when I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I went to the beach. I had always loved the ocean. There was something about the endless stretch of water, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, that made me feel small in the best way possible. It was humbling, but also liberating. I hadn't been to the beach in ages. My family used to go every summer, and the memory of those trips was bittersweet now. But I wasn't going to let those memories keep me from something that brought me peace. So I packed a small bag with a blanket and a book and headed out. The beach wasn't crowded. There were a few people walking along the shore, but the sense of quiet solitude was what I craved. I found a spot near the water's edge, laid out my blanket, and sat down, listening to the rhythmic sound of the waves. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of contentment. There was no rush, no obligation, just the vast, open expanse of the ocean and the sky stretching out before me. I opened my book, but it was the landscape in front of me that truly captured my attention. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the water. I closed the book and leaned back, letting the cool breeze brush against my face. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt right. I didn't need anything else. As I sat there, I thought about everything I had been through, about the years I had spent putting everyone else first, about the pain I had hidden behind my smile, about the slow but steady journey of reclaiming myself. It hadn't been easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it had been worth it. I had learned that life wasn't about waiting for things to happen to me. It was about stepping forward, even when I was scared, even when I wasn't sure what the next step would be. I had learned that I was allowed to have dreams, that I didn't have to sacrifice my own happiness for others. For so long, I had put my children's needs, my husband's needs, before my own, thinking that was what love meant. But love didn't mean losing yourself. It meant showing up. Not just for others, but for yourself. And that was the lesson I was beginning to understand. It wasn't that I had to stop being a mother or a grandmother. I would always be those things. But I didn't have to let those roles define me. I was more than that. I was Eleanor. And I had the right to live for me, to find joy in the things that made me happy, to seek fulfillment in my own life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I packed up my things and stood up, feeling the soft sand between my toes. There was still much to do, still much to work through. But as I walked back to my car, I felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The world felt bigger, more open, and I was ready to embrace it, one step at a time. That evening, when I got home, I sat at my desk and opened my journal again. The pages had filled with my thoughts, my reflections, and my dreams, and as I wrote, I realized that this was my new beginning. This was the life I had been waiting for. Not the life where I was waiting for others to make things right, but the life where I was actively creating my own happiness. I wrote about the beach, about the peace I had found there. I wrote about how, for the first time in years, I had felt like I belonged to myself. I wrote about the future, one that was still unknown, still unfolding, but one that was mine to share. It wasn't easy. It wasn't without its challenges, but I was finally living for myself. And that, I realized, was all I needed.